I agreed before the judge even finished reading her demand, and that was the moment everyone in the courtroom decided I had already lost. You could feel it in the air, that subtle shift, like a room collectively leaning toward a conclusion that seemed obvious. Olivia stood there in a tailored navy suit, calm, confident, already picturing what her life would look like once she walked out with half of everything I had built. Her lawyer didn't even try to hide the satisfaction, a slight smirk tucked behind rehearsed professionalism. Half the company, he had said, as if it were just another line item, something divisible, something clean. But companies aren't clean. They're built in late nights, in missed holidays, in years that blur together until all you remember is the grind. I sat there, hands folded, posture steady, and said the one word they were waiting for. Fine. No hesitation. No argument. No visible fight. Just agreement. The judge paused, pen hovering slightly above the page, like even she expected resistance, some last-minute objection, something to complicate the narrative. But I gave her nothing. And that silence worked exactly the way I needed it to. Because people don't question a man who surrenders too easily. They assume weakness. They assume exhaustion. They assume defeat. Olivia turned her head just enough to look at me, not fully, just a glance from the corner of her eye, the kind you give someone who no longer matters. There was a time that look would have meant something different. A time when we stood on the same side of the table, when this company wasn't a prize but a shared dream scribbled on napkins over cheap takeout. Back when success was measured in paying rent on time and not overdrafting the account. But somewhere along the way, the numbers got bigger, and so did the distance between us. I didn't notice it at first. Or maybe I did, and I chose not to see it. That's the thing about slow changes. They don't announce themselves. They settle in quietly, like dust on a surface you stop checking. By the time you realize it's there, it's already everywhere. The courtroom felt colder than it should have, the kind of controlled temperature that never quite matches the moment. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting everything in a pale, even glow that made it hard to read anyone's true expression. But I didn't need to read them. I already knew what they believed. I was the husband who built something successful and was now being asked to split it down the middle. And I had just agreed. Simple story. Clean ending. Except stories like that only work when you don't look too closely at how they were written. The judge adjusted her glasses, ready to move forward, ready to formalize what everyone thought was inevitable. Olivia's lawyer began organizing his documents, efficient, confident, already transitioning from argument to collection. That was the moment I leaned forward slightly, just enough to shift the rhythm of the room without raising my voice. Your Honor, I said, calm, even, controlled, before you finalize anything, I'd like to show the court one document. The words didn't sound dramatic. They weren't meant to. But they landed anyway, cutting through the quiet like a change in direction no one had planned for. Olivia's expression didn't change at first. Why would it? In her mind, the outcome was already secured. And that was the part she never understood. Winning isn't decided when the demand is made. It's decided long before anyone steps into the courtroom. And by the time she asked for half my company, I had already decided exactly how much she would walk away with. The courtroom did not erupt or react the way people imagine in movies. There was no sudden noise or dramatic shift, just a subtle pause, the kind that stretches a second longer than it should and makes everyone slightly uncomfortable without knowing why. And in that pause I could see it begin, the first crack in Olivia's certainty, not fear. Not yet, just confusion, small and quiet, like a question she had not prepared to ask. Because in her version of events there was no room for anything unexpected. Everything had already been calculated, every number divided, every outcome rehearsed, and I had just stepped outside that script without raising my voice or changing my tone, which made it worse for her, because calm does not give you anything to fight against, it does not give you a target. It just sits there and forces you to listen. The judge looked at me over the rim of her glasses, not annoyed, not impatient, just curious, the kind of curiosity that comes from experience, from knowing that men who speak this way in moments like this are rarely improvising. What document are you referring to, Mr. Carter? She asked, her pen now resting flat on the desk instead of hovering, and that small movement mattered more than anything Olivia's lawyer had said in the last 10 minutes, because it meant the decision was no longer moving forward, it was waiting, and waiting changes everything. I reached into the folder I had brought with me, nothing flashy, no dramatic motion, just a simple manila folder, the kind you could overlook if you were not paying attention, which most people were not. Because they had already decided what kind of man I was, the kind who builds something and then watches it get divided, the kind who agrees when pressured, the kind who does not push back, and I let them believe that for a long time, longer than I should have, even before we walked into this courtroom, because sometimes the most effective move is not to correct a misunderstanding, it is to let it grow until it becomes useful. Olivia shifted slightly beside her attorney, her posture tightening just enough that only someone who knew her well would notice, and I did. I had spent years noticing the small things, the way her tone changed when she was hiding something, the way her questions started to sound more like calculations than conversations, the way she began asking about percentages instead of plans. It had not started here, it had not even started recently, this moment was just where it surfaced, where everything that had been building quietly finally had a stage. I slid the document across the table toward my attorney, who passed it to the clerk, and from there it moved to the judge, a simple chain of hands, nothing dramatic, no raised voices, just paper moving from one person to another, and yet that movement carried more weight than every argument made before it. Olivia's lawyer leaned forward slightly, trying to catch a glimpse, trying to stay ahead of something he did not yet understand, but that was the problem. You cannot stay ahead of something you never saw coming. The judge began reading, slowly, carefully, not skimming, not rushing, and that was the moment the room shifted again, not outwardly, not in any way you could point to, but internally. In the way attention sharpens when people realize they might have missed something important. I leaned back in my chair, not relaxed, not tense, just steady, because this was not the moment where anything changed for me. This had already been decided long before today, long before the paperwork, long before the filing, back when Olivia first started asking questions that did not feel like curiosity anymore, back when I realized that what we were building together was no longer what she valued. And that was when I stopped explaining and started preparing, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of clarity, because once you see the direction something is going, you either ignore it or you adjust, and I chose to adjust. The judge turned a page, her expression tightening just slightly, not enough for most people to catch, but enough for Olivia's lawyer to notice, and when he did, his confidence shifted, just a fraction, just enough to matter. "Your Honor," he began, his voice still controlled but no longer as smooth. "If I may review that document." And there it was, the first request, the first sign that the ground under him was not as stable as he thought, and Olivia finally turned her head fully toward me, no longer a glance, no longer casual, now direct, searching, trying to read something in my face that I had stopped showing a long time ago, and in that moment I realized something simple and absolute. She did not understand what she was looking at, not the document, not the situation, and not me. And that was the only advantage I had ever needed. The judge did not speak right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to make every person in the room lean forward without realizing it, because silence in a courtroom is never empty, it is always carrying something, and this one carried weight, the kind that settles slowly and forces people to reconsider what they thought they understood. Olivia's lawyer stood there waiting, still composed but no longer relaxed, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table as if grounding himself, and when the judge finally looked up, her expression was no longer neutral, it was focused, deliberate, the kind of look that signals a shift from routine to scrutiny. "Counselor," she said, directing her attention toward Olivia's attorney, "are you aware of this ownership structure?" And the question landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it was not confrontational, it was factual, and facts leave very little room to maneuver. Her lawyer hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the room to register that something was off. "Your Honor, I would need a moment to review the full document," he replied, choosing his words carefully, but the confidence that had filled his voice Earlier was no longer there, it had thinned out, replaced by something more cautious. Olivia turned back toward him quickly, her composure slipping just slightly now, not enough to appear dramatic, but enough to show that she was no longer certain of the ground she was standing on, and that was when the realization began to take shape, not fully formed, not yet, but present. Like a shadow that had always been there but only became visible when the light changed, I watched it happen without moving, without reacting, because this was not the moment to explain anything, this was the moment for them to discover it themselves, and discovery always hits harder than explanation. The judge flipped back to the first page, then forward again, tracing the structure line by line, and when she spoke again, her tone was measured, precise. According to this, the company in question is held under a pre-established trust, with controlling interest assigned prior to the filing of this case. She said, each word placed carefully, leaving no room for interpretation, and in that sentence the entire narrative shifted, because the company Olivia had been asking to divide was not structured the way she believed. It was not something that could be split in half with a simple ruling, it had already been placed somewhere else, somewhere she did not have access to, somewhere she had never even asked about, and that was the part that mattered most, not the document itself, but the fact that she had never thought to look for it. Olivia's lips parted slightly as if to speak, then closed again. The words not forming because the premise they would have relied on no longer existed. Her lawyer leaned closer to the document now, scanning more quickly, searching for something that could restore the position they had walked in with. But the more he read, the more his posture changed, the subtle straightness of certainty replaced by the slight forward lean of someone trying to catch up, and that shift was everything, because cases like this are not won in a single moment. They are won when one side realizes they are no longer in control of the story. Mr. Carter, the judge said, turning her attention back to me. When was this trust established? And there it was, the question that mattered, not whether the document was valid, not whether it existed, but when it had been put into place, because timing changes intention, and intention changes everything. I met her gaze evenly, not defensive, not aggressive, just clear. It was established 18 months ago, Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, and that answer landed differently than anything before it, because it pushed the timeline back, far beyond this case, far beyond the argument, back to a point where nothing had yet been filed, nothing had yet been claimed, and that forced everyone in the room to reconsider not just what was happening now, but what had been happening then. Olivia's head turned toward me again, slower this time, her eyes searching, not for weakness, not for emotion, but for context. For something that could explain how she had missed this, how something this significant had existed without her knowledge, and that was the truth she was not ready to face. It had not been hidden from her, not directly, it had simply never been part of the version of reality she chose to see, and by the time she realized that, it was already too late to change it. There are moments when the truth does not arrive like a shock but like a slow realization, one detail connecting to another until the full picture becomes impossible to ignore, and I could see that process beginning behind Olivia's eyes as she replayed the last 18 months in her head, searching for something she had missed, something that could explain how a structure this significant had been put into place without her fully understanding it. But the answer was simpler than she wanted it to be. It had not been hidden behind secrecy or deception, it had been hidden behind indifference, because by the time I made that decision, she had already stopped paying attention to anything that did not immediately benefit her. The judge's question about timing still lingered in the air, not as a challenge but as a pivot point, and timing matters because it reveals intent, it separates reaction from preparation. It shows whether something was done out of fear or out of foresight, and this was never about fear. It was about clarity. 18 months ago the company was growing faster than either of us had expected, contracts expanding, revenue stabilizing, the kind of growth that looks impressive from the outside but feels fragile when you are the one responsible for holding it together. I remember sitting in my office late one night, long after everyone else had gone home. The glow of the desk lamp cutting through the dark, spreadsheets open, projections laid out, and for the first time I was not thinking about how to grow the company, I was thinking about how to protect it, because growth attracts attention, and attention changes people. It changes how they talk, how they think, what they value, and I had started to notice that shift in Olivia long before she ever filed anything in court. It showed up in small ways at first, questions that used to be about direction turning into questions about percentages. Conversations that used to revolve around ideas turning into conversations about numbers. She would ask how much a contract was worth before asking what it meant for the company, and that shift was not dramatic enough to confront, but it was consistent enough to recognize, and once you recognize a pattern, you cannot unsee it. I did not react right away. I did not accuse or argue, because those reactions rarely change anything, they just escalate the moment without addressing the underlying direction. Instead, I started asking different questions, not out loud, but to myself. Questions about what would happen if the priorities I was seeing continued, questions about what the company would look like if decisions were driven by immediate gain instead of long-term stability, and more importantly, questions about what would happen if the person standing next to me stopped seeing the company as something we built together and started seeing it as something to claim. Those are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. And the night I finally answered them honestly was the night everything changed, not on the surface. Not in a way anyone else could see, but in the decisions that followed. I reached out to an attorney the next morning, not in a rush, not in panic, just a quiet, deliberate step, and we sat down and talked through structures, protections, options that most people do not consider until it is too late, trusts, ownership layers, legal frameworks designed not to hide assets but to define them clearly, to place them in a position where they could not be easily misinterpreted or divided without context. It was not a complicated process, but it was a precise one, every signature intentional, every clause reviewed, and when it was finished, the company was no longer something that could be reduced to a simple fraction. It existed within a structure that required understanding, not assumption, and that difference is everything, because assumptions are easy to make and even easier to act on, but understanding takes effort, and effort is something Olivia had already started to withdraw. The judge closed the document slowly, her fingers resting on the cover for a moment as if confirming what she had just read, and when she looked back up, the room felt different again, not tense, not chaotic, just shifted, like a balance had been recalibrated. Olivia's lawyer straightened slightly, trying to regain his footing, but the confidence that had carried him into this room was no longer aligned with the facts in front of him, and Olivia sat there, perfectly still, the composure she had walked in with now held together by something thinner than certainty. Because for the first time she was not reacting to what she expected, she was reacting to what she had not prepared for. And that is where control begins to slip, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, one realization at a time, until the outcome you were so sure of no longer belongs to you. The difference between control and confidence is that confidence can disappear the moment it is challenged, but control does not rely on appearance, it relies on structure, and what Olivia was losing in that moment was not just confidence in the case, it was the illusion that she had ever been in control of it. Her lawyer cleared his throat slightly, a subtle reset. The kind professionals use when they need to regain momentum without drawing attention to the fact that they lost it. Your Honor, he said carefully, while the existence of a trust is noted, we would argue that marital contribution and shared lifestyle still establish a claim to equitable distribution. And it was a solid argument on the surface, one that works in many cases, one that relies on the idea that effort and time spent together translate into shared ownership. But that argument depends on something very specific. It depends on access, on participation, on a clear connection between the individual and the asset being claimed, and that was exactly where the foundation began to weaken. The judge nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without accepting it. And where in this structure, she asked, tapping the document lightly, is Mrs. Carter listed as a beneficiary or controlling party? And the question was not aggressive, it was procedural. But procedural questions often carry the most weight because they are rooted in what is documented, not what is assumed. Olivia's lawyer glanced back down at the document, flipping through pages more quickly now, searching for a line, a clause, anything that could support the claim he had just made. But the absence of something can be more powerful than its presence, and the more he searched, the clearer that absence became. Olivia shifted again in her seat, her composure now thinner, her breathing just slightly more noticeable, not dramatic, not outwardly emotional, but no longer as steady as it had been when she walked in, and that was the part most people misunderstand. Moments like this are not defined by explosions or arguments, they are defined by quiet realizations, by the slow recognition that the ground you were standing on was never as solid as you believed. I did not interrupt, I did not add anything, because adding to this moment would have weakened it. This was not about persuasion anymore, it was about clarity. And clarity does not need to be forced, it just needs to be allowed to settle. The judge closed the document again, this time with more finality. Her decision not yet spoken but already forming. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone even. "To confirm, the trust predates the filing of this action and establishes ownership outside of direct marital control." And again, it was not a question meant to challenge, it was a confirmation meant to solidify. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, and that simple answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it aligned with the document, with the timeline, with the structure that had already been reviewed. Olivia finally spoke, her voice controlled but no longer effortless. "This was never discussed," she said, not to the judge, but toward me, and for a moment the courtroom felt smaller, not physically, but emotionally, because that statement was not about the case, it was about something deeper, something personal, and that is where most people lose focus. They shift from facts to feelings, from structure to fairness, but the law does not operate on what feels fair, it operates on what is established, what is documented. What can be verified. I met her gaze briefly, not cold, not defensive, just direct. "It was not hidden," I said calmly. "It was simply not something you asked about." And that was the truth, not sharp, not exaggerated, just clear, and clarity can feel harsh when it replaces assumption. Her expression tightened, not in anger, but in recognition, because somewhere in that statement was the realization that the distance between us had not just been emotional, it had been informational. She had stopped looking at the details that did not immediately serve her perspective, and by the time those details mattered, they were already in place. Her lawyer attempted to pivot again, adjusting his approach. "Your Honor, we would request additional time to review the implications of this structure." But even that request carried a different tone now, less assertive, more cautious, and the shift was complete, not in a single moment, but in a series of small ones that added up to something undeniable. The judge considered it briefly, then nodded once, not dismissing the request, but not granting it in a way that would change the direction of the case, because the direction had already been set by something much more concrete than argument. It had been set by preparation, by decisions made long before this room, long before this conversation, and that is the part most people overlook. Outcomes like this are not created in the moment they are revealed, they are created in the moments no one else is paying attention to, when choices are made quietly, deliberately, without the need for recognition, and by the time those choices are seen, they are no longer flexible, they are final. By the time the request for additional review settled into the record, the energy in the courtroom had shifted in a way that no one could reverse, not with arguments, not with time, because what had changed was not just the direction of the case but the understanding of it, and once understanding changes, everything that follows is built on a different foundation. Olivia sat there still, composed on the surface. But the certainty that had carried her into this room was no longer present, it had been replaced by something quieter, something more analytical, as if she was trying to reconstruct the last 18 months in real time, looking for the moment where things could have gone differently. But that is the problem with hindsight. It gives you clarity without giving you control, it lets you see what happened without letting you change it. Her lawyer leaned closer to her, speaking in a low voice, controlled and precise, likely outlining options, possible next steps, angles that could still be explored, but even from where I sat, it was clear those options were narrowing, not expanding, because every strategy depends on the facts it is built on. And the facts were no longer aligned with the narrative they had prepared. The judge made a note on the file in front of her, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of movement that signals a decision is forming rather than being debated, and that distinction matters. Debates are fluid, decisions are not. The court recognizes the validity of the trust structure as presented, she said finally, her voice steady, measured, and in that statement there was no drama, no emphasis, just confirmation, but confirmation is often more decisive than any ruling, because it establishes what will and will not be considered moving forward. Olivia's lawyer straightened again, adjusting his posture as if preparing for another attempt, but this time there was a restraint in his approach, a recognition that pushing too hard against a confirmed structure could weaken his position further. Your Honor, we would request that the court consider contributions made during the marriage in evaluating any remaining assets, he said, carefully redirecting, and it was a reasonable move, shifting focus away from what could not be claimed toward what might still be accessible. But even that shift carried an unspoken admission: the original objective was no longer viable, and that realization settled over the room in a quiet, unmistakable way. Olivia did not speak this time. She did not object or interject, she simply listened, her attention now fixed not on me, not on the outcome she had expected, but on the process unfolding in front of her, because for the first time, she was not ahead of it, she was inside it, reacting instead of directing, and that is a difficult position for anyone who is used to control. The judge nodded once, acknowledging the request without committing to it. The court will take all relevant contributions into account as appropriate, she replied, leaving the door open but narrowing the path, and that is how these moments resolve, not with a single decisive statement, but with a series of controlled acknowledgments that gradually define the boundaries of what is possible. I remained where I was, hands still, posture unchanged, not because I was unaffected, but because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required presence, because everything that mattered had already been done, not here, not today, but in the quiet decisions that led to this point, and that is the part most people never see. They see the outcome, the reveal, the shift in control, but they do not see the hours spent thinking through scenarios, the conversations that happen long before conflict becomes visible, the choices made without an audience, without validation. Just a clear understanding of where things are heading and what needs to be done to prepare for it. Olivia's eyes moved back toward me again, slower this time, not searching for weakness, not looking for emotion, but trying to reconcile the version of me she had carried with the reality sitting across from her. And that gap between perception and reality is where most misunderstandings live, because people do not always change. Sometimes they simply stop explaining themselves, and when they do, others fill that silence with assumptions that feel accurate until they are tested, and once they are tested, they either hold or they collapse, and in this case, they had collapsed quietly, without spectacle, without confrontation, just a shift from belief to fact. The judge closed the file in front of her, not as a final ruling, but as a clear indication that the central issue had been addressed, and as that sound settled into the room, it carried a sense of closure that did not need to be announced. Because everyone present understood what it meant, the direction was no longer uncertain, the outcome was no longer a matter of argument, it was a matter of process, and process follows structure, not expectation, and that is where the difference lies between what people think will happen and what actually does. Once the core of the case had been quietly redirected, everything that followed felt less like a battle and more like a formality. But formalities matter because they define how an outcome is recorded, not just how it is understood, and the way something is recorded determines how it exists long after the moment has passed. The judge adjusted the documents in front of her, aligning them with a precision that reflected the shift from argument to resolution, and when she spoke again, her tone carried that same measured clarity. The court will proceed with evaluation based on assets that fall within direct marital ownership and verifiable contribution, she said, not dismissing Olivia's position entirely, but narrowing it to a space that was significantly smaller than what she had entered the room expecting, and that narrowing was not dramatic, it did not come with raised voices or visible frustration, but it was decisive, because it redefined the scale of everything that would follow. Olivia's lawyer nodded, acknowledging the direction, already adjusting his approach in real time, but even that adjustment carried a limitation, because you cannot expand a position that has already been structurally reduced, you can only work within what remains, and what remained was no longer the company, not the foundation, not the thing that had been the center of her claim. It was whatever existed outside of that structure, whatever could still be defined as shared within the boundaries now set by the court. Olivia sat quietly, her posture still composed, but no longer projecting the same sense of certainty. It was not defeat in the way people imagine it, not sudden or visible, but a gradual acceptance that the outcome she had planned for was no longer available, and that is a different kind of realization, one that does not erupt but settles, slowly, into every thought that follows. I watched without reacting, because there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to prove. The document had already done what it was meant to do, not by overpowering the argument, but by redefining it, and once something is redefined at that level, everything else becomes secondary. Olivia's lawyer began outlining the remaining considerations: contributions to shared accounts, residential property, smaller financial assets that could still be evaluated within the context of the marriage, and as he spoke, the scale of the discussion shifted further, from millions to details, from control to distribution. And that shift was the final confirmation that the center of the case had moved. Olivia finally exhaled, a small release of tension that had been building beneath the surface, not dramatic, not noticeable to most, but enough to signal that she understood, not just what had happened, but what it meant. Her eyes moved briefly toward me again, not searching this time, not questioning, but acknowledging something that had not been clear before, that the version of me she had relied on, the one she believed would react, argue, resist, had never been the version sitting across from her now, and that difference had shaped everything. The judge continued, methodical, consistent, moving through the remaining elements with the same controlled pace, but the weight of the moment had already passed, the outcome no longer hanging in uncertainty, just unfolding in process, and process does not rush, it follows its own rhythm, unaffected by expectation, unaffected by what anyone hoped would happen. I remained still, not out of indifference, but because stillness was all that was required. There is a point in situations like this where action becomes unnecessary, where the decisions that mattered have already been made and all that remains is to let them stand, and this was that point. Olivia's lawyer concluded his revised argument, focused now on what could realistically be addressed, and the judge acknowledged it with a nod, making notes that would translate into the final ruling. But even before those words were formally spoken, the direction was clear. Not because of opinion, not because of persuasion, but because of structure, because of timing, because of preparation, all the things that do not draw attention when they are put into place but define everything when they are finally seen. Olivia sat back slightly in her chair, the smallest shift in posture, but one that marked the end of resistance, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one, the recognition that pushing further would not change the framework that had already been established, and that is where most conflicts resolve, not when one side overwhelms the other, but when one side understands that the foundation they were relying on is no longer there, and in that understanding, everything else becomes clear. The room felt quieter now, not because there was less happening, but because there was less uncertainty, and uncertainty is what creates tension. Once it is gone, what remains is simply the outcome taking its place. By the time the final pieces of the case were being arranged into a formal decision, the atmosphere in the courtroom had settled into something steady and controlled, no longer driven by expectation or tension but by procedure, and procedure has a way of stripping moments down to their essentials, leaving only what can be confirmed, documented, and concluded. The judge reviewed her notes one last time, her expression composed, her focus exact, and when she began to speak, there was no hesitation, no need to build toward anything, because everything that needed to be established had already been laid out. Based on the presented structure and supporting documentation, the court recognizes that the primary business entity falls outside the scope of direct marital division, she said, her voice even, measured, and final in a way that did not require emphasis, and in that statement the central question of the case was resolved, not dramatically, not with impact, but with clarity. Olivia remained still, her reaction contained, but the meaning of those words was unmistakable. The claim that had defined her position from the beginning had been reduced to something that no longer existed within the court's authority to divide. Her lawyer nodded slightly, acknowledging the ruling. already transitioning his focus toward the remaining aspects that would now define the outcome, but those aspects were smaller, narrower, contained within limits that had already been established. The judge continued, outlining the distribution of remaining marital assets, referencing contributions, timelines, and documented ownership, each point delivered with the same steady precision, and as she spoke, the scale of everything became clear. What had once been a case centered on a company was now a case centered on details, and details, while important, do not carry the same weight as the foundation they once surrounded. I listened without interruption. Not because I was disengaged, but because this part of the process did not require input, it required acknowledgement. The outcome was no longer something to influence, it was something to receive. Olivia's gaze shifted downward briefly, not in defeat, but in focus, as if she was aligning her understanding with what was being stated, and that alignment is where acceptance begins, not in a single moment, but in a series of small recognitions that build into something final. Her lawyer made a brief note, then another, his movements efficient but quieter. Now, the confidence that had been present at the beginning replaced by a more measured approach, one that reflected the reality of the situation rather than the expectation he had brought into it. The judge concluded her review with a final statement, summarizing the distribution and confirming that the ruling would be entered into record, and when she closed the file, the sound was soft, controlled, but definitive. The kind of sound that signals an end without needing to announce it. The room remained quiet for a moment longer than necessary, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, because everyone present understood that what had just happened was not a shift in argument, it was a resolution. Olivia exhaled slowly, a controlled release, then straightened slightly, her posture returning to something more composed, not the same as when she had entered, but steady in its own way. As if she had moved from expectation to understanding, and that understanding, even when it is not what you wanted, has a certain clarity to it. I remained where I was for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but out of completion, because there is a difference between leaving a moment and finishing it. And this needed to be finished, not rushed, not reacted to, just acknowledged for what it was, a conclusion built not in this room, but in the decisions that led to it. And as I stood, the movement felt simple, unremarkable, because the significance of the moment had already passed. It was not in the standing, not in the leaving, but in everything that had been quietly set in motion long before any of us walked into this courtroom. Olivia looked toward me one last time, not with confusion, not with challenge, but with a kind of recognition that had not been there before, not of what she had lost, but of what she had misunderstood, and that distinction matters, because misunderstanding is what creates conflict, and clarity is what resolves it. Even when the outcome is not shared, the courtroom began to move again, papers gathered, chairs shifting, the routine of closure taking over. But for me, the moment was already complete, not because of the ruling itself, but because of what it represented, a confirmation that preparation, when done quietly and deliberately, does not need to announce itself, it simply stands when it is finally seen. The hallway outside the courtroom felt different from the moment we had just left, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with finality, the kind of quiet that comes when something has fully resolved and there is nothing left to argue, no angle left to explore, just the reality of what is now in place. I walked forward at a steady pace, not rushed, not lingering, because there was no reason to do either. The outcome was not something I needed to celebrate, and not something I needed to escape from. It simply was what it was, a result built long before this day ever arrived. Behind me I could hear the soft movement of others exiting, conversations beginning in low voices, the mechanics of people shifting from a formal setting back into their own lives. But none of it pulled my attention, because for me the important part had already happened, not when the judge spoke, not when the document was read, but in the realization that preparation does not need recognition to be effective, it only needs to be correct. I pushed open the courthouse doors and stepped outside, the air cooler than inside, carrying that slight edge that reminds you that the world continues regardless of what happens in any one room. Cars passed along the street, people moved along the sidewalk, ordinary motion that had nothing to do with what had just taken place, and that contrast mattered, because it grounded everything. Reminded me that while moments like this feel significant, they are only part of a much larger flow. Olivia's footsteps came a few seconds later, slower, measured, and I did not turn immediately, not out of avoidance, but because there was no urgency in acknowledging what had already been understood. When I finally did glance back, she had stopped a few feet behind me, her posture composed, her expression calm in a way that was different from before, not controlled for appearance, but settled through understanding. "You knew this would happen," she said, her voice even, not accusatory, not emotional, just a statement that carried its own weight. I considered the words for a moment, not because I needed to think of an answer, but because the answer needed to be exact. "I knew what I needed to do," I replied, and that was the truth, not a claim of prediction, not a statement of certainty, but an acknowledgement of preparation, because no one knows exactly how things will unfold, they only decide how ready they are for the possibilities. She nodded once, a small motion, as if aligning that answer with everything she had just experienced, and for a moment there was nothing else to say, not because there were no words left, but because the words that mattered had already been spoken in different ways, through actions, through choices, through decisions made when no one else was watching. She looked past me briefly, toward the street, then back again. "I thought I understood how everything worked," she said, quieter this time, and there was no bitterness in it, just recognition, the kind that comes when assumptions are replaced by reality. I held her gaze for a second, then nodded slightly, not in agreement or disagreement, but in acknowledgement, because understanding is not something you give someone, it is something they reach on their own, and once they reach it, it does not need to be explained. The space between us felt different now, not tense, not unresolved, just clear, like something that had been clouded for a long time had finally settled, and clarity, even when it comes at a cost, has a way of simplifying everything that follows. She stepped back slightly, not retreating, just creating distance. The kind that signals the end of a shared path rather than the continuation of one, and as she turned to leave, there was no need to stop her, no need to add anything, because closure does not come from the last thing you say, it comes from the absence of anything left to prove. I watched her walk away for a moment, not out of attachment, but out of recognition of what had been, and what was no longer there. Then I turned back toward the street and kept moving, the rhythm of my steps steady, unhurried, because the direction ahead was no longer uncertain. It was defined by something simple, something that had been true long before any of this began. Sometimes the strongest move is not the one that looks like resistance, sometimes it is the one that looks like agreement, because agreement, when it is intentional, can change the entire outcome without ever raising its voice.